Number 10 is Queen Tamar of Georgia, and the story of Tamar begins with an insult. In the year 1202 AD, a letter arrived at the royal court in Tbilisi. It came from the Sultan of Rum, Rukn ad-Din II, one of the most powerful men in the Islamic world and the ruler of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. The letter was addressed to Tamar, Queen of Georgia, and the Sultan's tone was the tone a wolf uses when it speaks to a lamb. He called Tamar a simpleton. He demanded her surrender, and then he offered her a choice that was not really a choice at all. If Tamar converted to Islam, he would honor her by making her his wife. If she refused, he would still take her, but only as a concubine. The envoy who delivered the message stood in the throne room of Tbilisi and waited for the response of the woman he had just been sent to humiliate. The response came from Tamar's chancellor, a mountain of a man named Zechariah, and the response was a single punch that laid the envoy on the marble floor. Tamar's reply followed a moment later, and it was shorter than the Sultan's letter. It said only that the Georgian army was already at his gates. That was not diplomacy. That was a prophecy. Tamar of Georgia was born around 1160 AD, daughter of King George III, and her father had done something unprecedented in the history of the medieval Caucasus. He had crowned her in his own lifetime as co-ruler, not queen consort, not princess regnant, king. In Georgian, the language of her court, she carried the title Mep, which is a masculine word meaning king, and she was crowned as a king in the eyes of her nobles and her god. When her father died in 1184 AD, the aristocracy tried to break her. They forced her into an unwanted marriage with a Russian prince named Yuri, and when Yuri turned out to be a violent alcoholic who tried to seize the throne, she divorced him, exiled him, and defeated his coup with the help of a second husband of her own choosing, an Ossetian warrior prince named David Soslan, who would eventually command her armies at Bassiani. By the time the Sultan of Rum sent his letter, Tamar's kingdom was the superpower of the Caucasus. It stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian, from the mountains of Ossetia down into the plains of Armenia. Her generals had captured city after city, from the emirs of Persia and the sultanates of Anatolia. Her merchants controlled the trade routes between the Islamic world and the Christian world. And when the Sultan of Rum finally decided that Georgia had grown too rich, too proud, and too female to be tolerated, he assembled the largest army the Seljuks had fielded in a generation and marched east. The two armies met in the Bassini Valley about 60 kilometers northeast of the city of Erzurum in what is now northeastern Turkey. Some estimates put the Seljuk force as high as 150,000 men. The Georgian army was outnumbered by a significant margin, and yet the chroniclers of Tamar's reign tell us that on the morning of the battle, the queen herself gave the address. She stood barefoot in the stone-carved monastery town of Vardzia, and she spoke to her army from the balcony of the church. The chronicle says she was weeping. The chronicle also says her generals, watching her, wept. With her then mounted their horses and rode north to war. Bassani was decided by a Georgian trick. David Soslan sent his advance guard into a lightning strike against the Seljuk camp. The Seljuk forces recovered from the surprise, counterattacked, and for a moment, it looked as if the Turks would carry the field. Then the main Georgian force struck the Seljuk flanks. The Sultan's banner fell. Rukn ad-Din, wounded, fled toward Erzurum. His brother was captured, and the Georgians ransomed him back for the value of a single horseshoe. That was Tamar's answer to the man who had called her a simpleton. Bassani made Georgia the dominant military power from the Caspian to the Black Sea. Tamar's armies would go on to capture Kars, occupy Erzurum, march into Armenia, and even sponsor the founding of a new Greek empire on the Black Sea, the Empire of Trebizond, ruled by two nephews of hers who owed their thrones to her cavalry. When she died in 1213 AD, Georgia's borders had never been wider, and Georgian tradition still calls her Tamar the Great. The Orthodox Church calls her Saint Tamar. But she is the only saint in Christian tradition whose armies broke a Seljuk sultan and pulled the teeth from an Islamic empire's northern front. The king who was crowned a queen made half the ancient Silk Road answer to a woman. That was 10. Number 9 lived 300 years earlier and answered to a different name, but she outgeneraled the Vikings. Number 9 is Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, the daughter of Alfred the Great and the woman who spent the last decade of her life turning Anglo-Saxon England into a machine for eating Viking kingdoms. In the summer of 1918 AD, messengers arrived at her fortress at Tamworth carrying an offer that had never been offered to a woman in the history of the Danelaw. The men of York, the great Viking capital of northern England, the city that Ivar the Boneless had captured 50 years earlier, the city from which Norse warlords had ruled the north of the island for 2 generations, wanted to submit. They were prepared to pledge their loyalty. They were prepared to kneel. They had chosen her over her brother, Edward the Elder, the King of Wessex. They had chosen her over her nephew, Æthelstan, the future king of the English. They wanted to swear fealty to the Lady of the Mercians, the daughter of Alfred, because the Lady of the Mercians was the one who had beaten them. Æthelflæd had been born around 870 AD, the eldest child of King Alfred, the man who saved Anglo-Saxon England from the great heathen army. She grew up watching her father hide in the marshes at Athelney and then rise again to defeat the Danes at Edington in 878 AD. She was married as a teenager to Æthelred, Lord of the Mercians, a nobleman who ruled Mercia as a subordinate king under Alfred's protection. And when Æthelred grew sick, somewhere around 902 AD, Æthelflæd quietly took over the government of the kingdom herself. Her husband was still alive. Her husband still bore the title, but it was Æthelflæd, in practice, who signed the charters, commanded the armies, and negotiated with the Welsh kings, the Scottish kings, and the Viking warlords across the border. When Æthelred died in 911 AD, there was no succession fight. The Mercian nobility simply confirmed what they had known for a decade. Æthelflæd was the ruler. She held the title Lady of the Mercians, Mercina Hæthelflæd, in Old English, and no woman had ever ruled a major Anglo-Saxon kingdom in her own name before. Æthelflæd did not waste it. Together with her brother Edward, King of Wessex, she began a decade-long war against the Danish territories east and north of the Mercian frontier. Her strategy was her father's strategy, upgraded and industrialized. She built burhs, fortified towns that anchored the countryside, and gave her armies places to withdraw to and resupply from. She built burhs at Bridgenorth, at Tamworth, at Stafford, at Warwick, at Cherbury, at Runcorn, at Chester, and at Edsbury. Each one was a dagger pointed into the Danelaw. And behind each dagger, she stationed the field army that would eventually drive the Vikings out of the English Midlands entirely. In the summer of 917 AD, she launched her first great offensive. She marched on the Viking-held burh of Derby, one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, the network of fortified towns from which the Danes controlled the middle of England. Derby fell to her assault before the 1st of August. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the cost of the victory with a single sentence remarkable because it is the only line in the entire chronicle that lets us hear the voice of a Mercian mourning. She won Derby, and there also 4 of her Thegans who were dear to her were killed within the gates. 4 men she loved, dead inside a Viking gate she had just torn open. The next year, in early 918 AD, she moved on Leicester, the second of the 5 boroughs. Leicester did not fight. The Danes of Leicester saw what had happened at Derby, and they surrendered before the walls could be breached. Æthelflæd took the city without spilling a drop of Mercian blood. It was after Leicester that the news came from York. The Danes of York had been ruled since 911 AD by a Norwegian sea king named Ragnall, a Viking from Dublin, an unpopular pagan who had seized the northern throne by force. The Christian Danish nobility of York had decided they preferred the Christian Anglo-Saxon lady who had just captured 2 of the 5 boroughs. They sent word to Tamworth. They would submit to her. They would swear oaths. She would be their overlord. Æthelflæd prepared to ride north to accept the greatest submission any English monarch had ever received from a Viking city. She never made the ride. On the 12th of June, 918 AD, 2 weeks before the midsummer meeting was to take place, she died at Tamworth, possibly of a stroke, aged around 48. Her brother Edward, the elder, took possession of Mercia within days and eventually deposed her daughter Æthelflæd to consolidate the 2 kingdoms. The Vikings held York for another generation. But every foundation stone of the England Athelstan would eventually unite in 927 AD was a stone Æthelflæd had laid. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called her Hæfdige. Her Irish contemporaries called her Famosissima Regina Saxonum, most famous queen of the Saxons. The Vikings knew her by a different name. Their sagas remembered an ancient Norse prophecy about an unbeatable woman who would appear at Ragnarok and make brave warriors cower before her. When they lost city after city to Æthelflæd, more than one Viking commander seemed to think the prophecy had come early. That was 9. Number 8 was another Christian queen, another widow, another avenger. But where Æthelflæd built kingdoms, this one burned them. Number 8 is Olga of Kiev. Number 8 is Princess Olga of Kiev. And the story of Olga begins with a body torn between 2 trees. In the year 945 AD, her husband, Prince Igor of Kiev, was murdered by a tribe called the Drevlians, a Slavic people who lived in the forests west of the Kievan Rus. Igor had ridden into their territory to demand extra tribute, and the Drevlians had seized him, tied him between 2 bent birch trees, and released the trees. The birches sprang apart. Igor was torn in half. The Drevlians then decided that killing a Kievan prince was not enough. They wanted to consume him, absorb him. They sent 20 of their most distinguished ambassadors to Kiev to inform Olga, the widow, that she would now marry their prince, a man named Mal, and that the union would combine their peoples into a single kingdom under Drevlian rule. When the delegation arrived in Kiev, Olga received them with courtesy. She told them she had a very unusual honor she wished to bestow on them. She would order her men to carry them from their landing boat to her court, not on foot, not on horseback, but seated in the boat itself, raised on the shoulders of the men of Kiev. The Drevlians were delighted. They climbed into the boat, seated in a row, and Olga's men lifted the boat and carried the delegation ceremonially through the streets. They carried the boat straight to a deep trench that Olga had ordered dug that morning in the courtyard of her palace. They tipped the boat into the trench. And while the Drevlian ambassadors screamed, still seated in their vessel, Olga leaned over the edge of the pit and asked, according to the Russian primary chronicle, whether they enjoyed the honor. Then she ordered the pit filled with earth. That was the first act. The second act came a few weeks later when Olga sent word to Prince Mal that she accepted his marriage proposal, but required that his most distinguished nobles come to Kiev to escort her back in appropriate style. The Drevlian aristocracy, still not knowing what had happened to the first delegation, sent their best men, their governors, their chieftains. Olga welcomed them warmly and invited them to bathe in her private bathhouse before the wedding feast. The bathhouse doors locked from the outside. Once the Drevlian nobles were inside and undressed, Olga's servants barred the doors and set the building on fire. Not one Drevlian noble emerged. The third act came after that. Olga sent word to the Drevlians that she now wished to travel personally to their capital, Iskorosten, to hold a funeral feast for her murdered husband at the very site of his death. She asked the Drevlians to prepare mead in enormous quantities. The Drevlians did. They gathered by the thousands, believing peace was finally coming. Olga wept publicly at the sight of Igor's death, poured out libations, ate with the mourners, and made sure the drinking went late into the night. When the Drevlians were incapable of standing, she gave the signal. Her retinue drew their swords. The primary chronicle says 5,000 Drevlians were massacred at that funeral feast. And then, in the following year, in 946 AD, she besieged the Drevlian capital of Iskorosten itself, and the fourth act unfolded. The siege dragged on for nearly a full year. The city refused to surrender. And so Olga sent word to the defenders that she had grown tired of vengeance and that she would accept a very modest tribute in exchange for lifting the siege. She wanted 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household. Every household in Iskorosten complied. The birds were delivered in wicker cages. Olga's men attached small pieces of cloth soaked in sulfur to the legs of each bird. When darkness fell, the cloths were lit and the birds were released. Every bird flew home. Every bird flew to its nest, which meant every bird flew to a thatched roof or a hayloft or a wooden eave inside Iskorosten. The city ignited in every corner simultaneously. The defenders panicked, tried to flee, and were cut down by Olga's men at the gates. Those who survived were sold into slavery or reduced to tribute peasantry. The Drevlians as a political power ceased to exist. Olga went on to rule Kiev and Rus as regent for her son, Sviatoslav, for nearly 20 years. She reformed the tribute system so that no future Kievan prince would ever again have to ride personally into hostile territory to collect payment. She traveled to Constantinople in 957 AMPS D and was baptized as a Christian by the Byzantine emperor, becoming the first ruler of the Rus to convert. She would eventually be canonized as Saint Olga, patron saint of widows and converts. The Russian Orthodox Church honors her every year on the 11th of July. In the icon paintings, she wears the crown of a saint. In the memory of the Drevlians, whatever memory they left behind, she wears something else. Whether the sparrow story really happened is debated by historians. The historian Nestor was writing 150 years after the events, and the burning birds trick appears in other cultures too. But the debate misses the point. Whether the sparrows flew or not, the truth of Olga is that she chose vengeance as a political theology and turned it into a governing philosophy. She taught the tribes of the forest that the throne of Kiev did not die with its king. That was 8. Number 7 is another queen who avenged a husband, but she did it against Rome. Number 7 is Queen Mavia of the Tanukids, an Arab Christian warrior queen who in the year 378 AD picked exactly the wrong moment to embarrass the Roman Empire. Or rather, she picked exactly the right moment. That was the year the Emperor Valens marched east to fight the Goths and was killed at Adrianople in the greatest Roman military catastrophe since Cannae. And in the months before Adrianople, while Valens was still trying to figure out how to save his eastern provinces from the Gothic invasion, an Arab queen was already tearing them apart from the south. Mavia was the widow of the Tanukid king Al-Hawari, and the Tanukids were a confederation of Arab tribes living on the desert frontier of the Roman Empire in what is now southern Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia. Under the terms of a Roman treaty called a fetus, the Tanukids served as foederati allied cavalry who guarded the imperial frontier against raids from further into the peninsula. When Al-Hawari died sometime in the 370s AD, the treaty technically expired. It had to be renewed with his successor. His successor was his widow, Mavia. Emperor Valens, an Arian Christian who had spent his entire reign persecuting Nicene Christians, made 2 enormous mistakes at once. First, he ignored Mavia's demand that a specific Nicene Christian holy man, named Moses, be appointed as the first bishop of the Arabs. Second, he seems to have assumed that the treaty could be re-signed with a woman on the same terms as with a man without renegotiation. Mavia's response was to withdraw her people from Roman territory into the desert. In the spring of 378 AMPS D, she gathered her horsemen, allied with other Arab tribes, and led them personally into Roman Phoenicia. She rode at the head of her army. The ancient historians agree on this, and it is not a rhetorical decoration. She commanded from the front, in person, and her generals reported to her on the field. The Tanukid cavalry was a light desert force built around Arabian horses, javelins, and lances. Against the heavy Roman infantry columns of Valens's eastern armies, the cavalry should have been outclassed. It was not. Mavia's Arabs had spent years fighting alongside the Romans, and they knew Roman tactics as well as any Roman commander did. They knew when to break off, when to strike, when to isolate a Roman column and cut it apart. They swept through Phoenicia and into Palestine. They reached the frontiers of Egypt. They defeated Roman field armies in open battle, plural, more than once. Sozomen, one of the ancient sources, records that the Romans were forced to bring generals across from other frontiers just to try to stabilize the situation. And even then, the Roman commanders could not force a decision. Valens, sitting in Antioch preparing to march north against the Goths, could not spare any more troops to fight a woman in the desert. And Mavia, with the certainty of a commander who has read her enemy correctly, kept applying pressure until the Emperor of Rome sued for peace, on terms she dictated. The peace of 378 AD gave Mavia everything she had asked for. Moses the Nicene monk was consecrated as the first bishop of the Arabs. The Tanukid Federation was restored to Roman alliance on new terms. And to seal the treaty, Mavia married her daughter, Princess Chasidat, to a distinguished Roman general named Victor, a Nicene Christian consul who had personally defied Valens over religious policy. Then the story took a twist that only history could write. When Valens marched north later that year, and was destroyed by the Goths at Adrianople on the 9th of August, 378 AD, the Roman Empire suddenly needed all the cavalry it could get. Mavia sent hers, Tanukid, horsemen, the same horsemen who had cut apart Roman columns 6 months earlier, rode to the defense of Constantinople. When the Goths, drunk on their Adrianople victory, appeared at the walls of the imperial city later that year, they were met by Arab cavalry that Mavia had sent. The Arab horsemen, according to the historian Zosimus, drove the Goths back from the walls of Constantinople and helped save the Roman East. Mavia's daughter Chesedat was killed in that fighting. What does this say about Mavia? That she was capable of switching from Rome's enemy to Rome's savior in the space of a single summer. That she understood better than most emperors did that war was a political tool and not an identity. The treaty she negotiated held for 5 years. In 383 AD, under different Roman leadership, the terms were revised and the Tanukids revolted again. That revolt was crushed. What happened to Mavia after that? No one knows for certain. Some sources say she died a wealthy Christian widow. Others say she vanished into the desert. But the Roman Empire never forgot her. The chroniclers, Rufinus, Socrates Scholasticus, Sozomen, and Theodoret all wrote about her at length. Rufinus called her the Queen of the Saracens who terrified the Romans. Adrianople is remembered as the year Rome lost to the Goths. It was also the year Rome lost to a woman. That was 7. Number 6 was another Eastern queen, and she went further than Mavia ever did. She did not just embarrass Rome. She carved an empire out of it. Number 6 is Zenobia of Palmyra, the desert queen who conquered Egypt, seized the Roman East, declared her son emperor, and forced one of the greatest Roman military commanders of the 3rd century to pull his legions off the Danube frontier and march thousands of miles across the Mediterranean to bring her down. Zenobia was born around 240 AD in Palmyra, a rich caravan city in the Syrian desert. Her name, in her native Palmyrene Aramaic, was Bat Zebai. Her family claimed descent from Ptolemaic queens of Egypt, and she claimed, when it suited her, that Cleopatra herself was one of her ancestors. She married Odenathus, the king of Palmyra and a Roman client ruler, and when he was assassinated in 2067 AD, along with his eldest son from a previous marriage, Zenobia stepped into the vacuum as regent for her own infant son, Vabalathus. The Roman East, at that moment, was in the middle of the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperor Valerian had been captured by the Persians in 260 AD. His son, Gallienus, had been assassinated. Emperor after emperor was being raised and killed by the legions. The Gallic emperors had broken away in the west. The Persians were raiding at will. And in the middle of all this chaos, Zenobia decided that if Rome could no longer defend its eastern provinces, someone should, and that someone would be her. She built up the Palmyrene army, an army built around Arab archers, heavy cataphracts, and desert cavalry. She surrounded herself with intellectuals, philosophers, and Greek advisors. Her tutor was said to have been the Neoplatonist philosopher Cassius Longinus. She spoke Aramaic, Greek, Egyptian, and Latin. And in 269 AD, she made her move. She sent her general Zabdas south into Roman Egypt with a Palmyrene army and an Egyptian ally named Timagenes. The Roman prefect of Egypt, Tenigino Probus, tried to expel them. Zenobia's forces captured him and beheaded him. By 270 AD, all of Egypt, one of the wealthiest provinces of the Roman Empire, and the grain supplier for the city of Rome itself, was under Palmyrene control. Zenobia declared herself Queen of Egypt. Then she turned north. Zabdas marched into Anatolia, and Palmyrene troops advanced as far west as Ankara in the middle of modern Turkey, then east into Syria, Palestine, Lebanon. By 271 AD, a Palmyrene empire stretched from the Nile to the Bosphorus, from the mountains of central Turkey to the deserts of Arabia. Zenobia began minting coins with her own image and the image of her son. She adopted the title Augusta. Her son, Vabalathus, was declared Augustus, that is to say, emperor. The break with Rome was total. And that was when the wrong emperor took the throne in Rome. Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, better known as Aurelian, came to power in 270 amps. D. Aurelian was one of those career military commanders the crisis of the 3rd century occasionally threw up. A peasant soldier from the Danube frontier who had risen through the ranks by sheer brutal competence. His nickname was Manu ad Ferrum, hand to iron. He spent his first years on the throne stabilizing the northern frontier against the Goths and the Alemanni. Then, in 272 AD, he marched east. Aurelian and Zenobia met first at Imai, near Antioch. Zenobia's cataphracts were among the finest heavy cavalry in the world, but Aurelian tricked them into a false retreat that pulled the Palmyran armored horsemen far ahead of the infantry, then turned and destroyed them piecemeal. Zenobia retreated to Emesa, modern Homs. Aurelian followed. At Emesa, the same trick worked again. The Palmyran army was shattered. Zenobia withdrew to her capital and prepared for the siege of Palmyra itself. The siege did not last long. Aurelian had brought food and water across the desert. Zenobia had not brought enough of either. She tried to slip out of the city on a fast camel riding east toward the Persian frontier, hoping the Sassanids would give her sanctuary. Aurelian's cavalry caught her on the banks of the Euphrates. What happened to Zenobia after her capture is disputed. Some sources say Aurelian brought her back to Rome in golden chains and paraded her in his triumph in 274 AD. Then, moved either by her dignity or by political calculation, granted her a villa at Tibur, modern Tivoli, where she lived out the rest of her life as a Roman matron, married again, raised more children, and became a patron of philosophers. Other sources say she was executed or died on the voyage back, or starved herself in captivity. What is not disputed is what she accomplished. In 5 years, an Arab queen took Egypt, took Anatolia, took the eastern trade route, minted her own coinage, adopted the title of empress, and forced a Roman emperor to conduct one of the largest expeditionary campaigns of the 3rd century to defeat her. Palmyra never recovered. When Palmyra revolted a second time in 273 AD, Aurelian returned and reduced the city to ruins. But Zenobia herself entered legend. Byzantine historians praised her intellect. Arab historians remembered her as Al-Zaba, a desert queen of learning and war. Medieval European writers included her in their lists of great women of history. Chaucer wrote about her in The Monk's Tale. She was the wife who became a warrior, the warrior who became an empress, and the empress who nearly rewrote the map of the Roman world. That was 6. Number 5 was younger than any queen on this list. She was 19 years old when she raised her first army. Number 5 is Lady Trieu of Vietnam, and the sentence she is remembered for is one of the most quoted sentences in the history of Vietnamese literature. In the year 248 AD, when her older brother tried to convince her to give up her plans for war and instead marry a suitable local lord, she is said to have answered him with a declaration that Vietnamese schoolchildren still learn today. I want to ride the storm, tread the dangerous waves, kill the great whales of the eastern sea, sweep out the borders, save the people from drowning. Why should I bow my head and stoop, resigning myself to being a slave and a concubine? Lady Trieu was around 19 years old when she spoke those words, and she was around 22 when she died on a mountainside surrounded by the largest imperial army that a Chinese emperor had ever sent to Vietnam. Between those two dates, she led one of the earliest and fiercest rebellions in the recorded history of Southeast Asia. Her full name in Vietnamese tradition is Trieu Thi Trinh, or Trieu Trinh Nuong. She is more often called Batrieu, Lady Trieu. She was born around 226 amps D in the region called Cuyu Chan in what is now Thanh Hoa province in northern Vietnam. In her lifetime, all of northern Vietnam was under the rule of the Eastern Wu, one of the 3 Chinese kingdoms that had emerged from the collapse of the Han Dynasty. Wu governors squeezed the Vietnamese with heavy taxation, forced labor, and the imposition of Chinese language and Chinese customs. The countryside seethed with resentment. Lady Trieu's parents died when she was young. She grew up in the household of her older brother, Trieu Quoc Dat, a local landowner and secret sympathizer with resistance to the Wu. According to Vietnamese tradition, her sister-in-law was a violent and abusive woman. Trieu, still a teenager, killed her sister-in-law and fled to the mountains around Mount Nua. On Mount Nua, she assembled a private army. Ancient sources say she gathered 1,000 followers, then 3,000, then more. Her recruits came from the peasant villages of the Kuchan lowlands, the mountain tribes of the interior, and eventually from her own brother's estate. Her brother, when he saw the scale of her operation, tried to talk her down. She gave him the answer about storms and whales and concubines. Her brother, according to legend, joined her. In the spring of 248 amps, she led her army down out of the mountains. She was described by later chroniclers as an extraordinary figure, wearing a gold-embroidered tunic, ivory shoes, and a gold pin through her hair, riding into battle at the head of her army on a war elephant. She fought with 2 swords. Her voice, the chronicles said, carried like a temple bell across the battlefield. She was said to be 9 feet tall. The 9 feet is folklore. The elephant is not. Vietnamese tradition and Chinese records agree that she rode elephants into combat, and elephants were a genuine feature of Southeast Asian warfare in that period. Her army struck first at a fortress called Tu Pho, an important Wu military base beside the Ma River. Tu Pho fell Lady True's forces, then began a guerrilla campaign that carried them across large parts of northern Vietnam. Vietnamese sources say she fought more than 30 battles in the space of 6 months. She struck Wu columns. In the jungle, she assaulted walled cities. She overran Wu supply lines. The Wu governor of the region reported to the imperial court that he could not hold. Whole districts of Chinese-appointed Vietnamese officials defected to her side. The Wu emperor, Sun Quan's grandson, responded by dispatching one of the empire's most experienced generals, a commander named Liu Yin, with a force of 8,000 elite Wu troops. Liu Yin's strategy was not to defeat Lady True in a single decisive battle. He knew better. His strategy was to bribe her supporters, split her coalition, and grind her down. He sent gold to the Vietnamese lords who had backed her. He offered amnesty to defectors. He waged psychological warfare in the villages. And he wore her army down through a series of battles that Lady True could not decisively win because she was ultimately outnumbered and out-resourced. In the 6th month of the rebellion, on the 22nd of February, 248 AD, Lady True was defeated in a final battle on Mount Tung in Tru Loc Commune, in modern Hao Loc district. What happened at the end is uncertain. One version of the story says she was killed in the fighting. Another, the version most Vietnamese schoolchildren know, says she climbed to the top of the mountain and took her own life rather than surrender. She was 22 or 23 years old. And here is what she left behind. Vietnamese folk tradition says that after her death, ghostly stories began to circulate in the Wu-occupied countryside. Chinese soldiers reported nightmares of a giant woman in golden robes riding an elephant. The Wu commander is said to have posted a mocking couplet in his camps that reads something like, "It is easy to fight a tiger with a spear, but hard to face the queen." 6 centuries later, Vietnamese lullabies still sang about her. "Sleep tight, my child, so that I can fetch water to wash the gilded saddle of the elephant. Climb the hill if you want to watch Lady General True on her golden gilded seat." Vietnamese resistance to Chinese rule would go on for another 700 years. In 939 AD, Vietnam finally won its independence and remained an independent kingdom for the next 1,000 years. Lady True did not live to see it. But when Vietnamese revolutionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries needed a symbol when they needed a name to invoke, they invoked her. In the temple built to honor her in Thanh Hoa province, her image still stands. And in the golden robe she wore into battle at 19, she is a reminder that a 19-year-old on an elephant can make an empire lose sleep. That was 5. Number 4 is 2 women, 2 sisters. And the empire they made kneel was the same empire that killed Lady True. Number 4 is the Trung Sisters, Trung Trac, and Trung Nhi, the 2 Vietnamese sisters, who, 2 centuries before Lady True, raised the first great national uprising against Chinese rule and did what nobody expected. They won. Trung Trac and her younger sister Trung Nhi were born around 12 AD in My Linh, a district in what is now the outskirts of modern Hanoi. Their father was a lac lord, a member of the Vietnamese aristocracy that had once ruled the Red River Delta before the Han Dynasty absorbed it. Their mother, according to Vietnamese tradition, was a woman named Man Thien, who trained her daughters in martial arts and military history alongside their brothers. Trung Trac married a man named Thi Sach, another lac lord from the neighboring district of Chu Dien. The husbands and wives of Vietnamese aristocratic families had grown increasingly restless under Han rule. Han governors had raised taxes to catastrophic levels. Han law was being imposed in place of Vietnamese custom. And in the year 39 AD, the Han governor of the region, a man named Su Ding, decided to make an example of Thi Sash. Su Ding was described by Vietnamese and Chinese sources alike as cruel and avaricious. He was afraid of the Lac lords, and he saw Thi Sash, Trung Trac's husband, as a potential leader of resistance. He arrested Thi Sash without trial and had him executed. That was the mistake. Trung Trac's response was not to grieve quietly. She was described in the Chinese chronicle Ho Han Shu as a woman possessing mettle and courage, and she was described in Vietnamese tradition as someone who had stirred her husband to rebellion in the first place. She did not go into mourning. She raised an army. In February of the year 40 AD, Trung Trac and Trung Ni rode out of My Linh at the head of a Vietnamese uprising. Their army was reportedly around 80,000 strong, and it included, according to Vietnamese tradition, 36 female generals, one of whom was said to be their own mother, Man Thien. The sisters rode war elephants. Their soldiers carried swords, bows, spears, and axes. They moved fast. They struck the Han administrative capital, Lien Lao. Governor Su Ding fled for his life, cutting his own hair, which was a serious cultural transgression to disguise himself as a peasant, and running for the Chinese border. Within a year, the Trung Sisters had captured 65 fortified towns, 65 citadels. Roman generals like Caesar and Pompey had built their reputations on numbers smaller than that. The territory the sisters liberated stretched from what is now southern China down to modern-day Hue in central Vietnam. And in the middle of this territory, at My Linh, the sisters proclaimed themselves queens of an independent state. Trung Trac was crowned queen. Trung Ni ruled beside her. They abolished the Han tax system. They restored Vietnamese customs. And for 2 years, they governed. This was the moment. This was the height. This was a Vietnamese kingdom ruled by two sisters in defiance of one of the largest empires in the world. Han Emperor Guangwu did not accept the situation. In 41 AD, he began preparing a punitive expedition. In 42 AD, he dispatched his greatest general, a veteran commander named Ma Yuan, along with a general named Lu Long, and a force of around 20,000 troops and 2,000 tower ships. Ma Yuan was one of the most feared Han generals of his generation. He had spent his career pacifying frontier tribes across the Han Empire. He was 58 years old, he was patient, he was ruthless, and he understood Vietnamese terrain better than any other Chinese general the emperor could have sent. Ma Yuan did not rush the sisters. He advanced slowly down the coast, building roads and stockpiling supplies as he went. He landed troops from the sea and coordinated them with his overland columns. He picked off Vietnamese aristocrats one by one, bribing some, defeating others, isolating the sisters from their allies. By 43 AD, he had cornered the Trung sisters at Cam Ke. The final battle was catastrophic for the Vietnamese. The Han sources record that thousands of Vietnamese warriors were killed or surrendered. Chinese records say the Trung sisters were captured and beheaded, and their heads sent to the imperial court. Vietnamese tradition says something different. Vietnamese tradition says that when the sisters saw that the battle was lost, they rowed together to the Hat Giang River and threw themselves into the water rather than surrender. Both traditions may be right in different ways. What is not disputed is that the Trung Rebellion ended in 43 AD and Ma Yuan re-established Han rule over Vietnam for the next 500 years. And yet, to this day, in every Vietnamese city, from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City, there are streets named Hai Ba Trung, the two Trung sisters. There are temples in their honor. There is an annual festival on the 6th day of the second lunar month, the day traditionally held to be the anniversary of their deaths, when Vietnamese communities across 4 continents parade colorful elephant floats through the streets to remember what 2 women did in the year 40 AD. Because what they did, no one else had done. They rode 2 war elephants against one of the greatest empires the ancient world produced. They took 65 citadels. They ruled a nation. And for 2 years, the Han Empire, an empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia, could not enter their kingdom. That was for Number 3 was another queen who bloodied the nose of a superpower, but this time the superpower was Rome, and the queen had only one eye. Number 3 is Candake Amanirenas of Kush, the one-eyed African queen who fought Augustus and made him blink. Around the year 27 BC, Augustus completed his conquest of Egypt. Cleopatra was dead. The Ptolemaic dynasty was extinct. Rome now controlled the Nile as far south as the First Cataract at Syene, modern Aswan. And south of Syene, upstream, lay another kingdom entirely. The Kingdom of Kush, ruled from the desert capital of Meroe by a line of queens who bore the title Candake, a Meroitic word that Romans and Greeks would later render as Candace. The Candake was not a queen consort. She was a ruling monarch, sometimes ruling alone, sometimes ruling alongside a king. She was expected to lead her armies personally. She was expected to be depicted in temple art with a bow in her hand and an enemy under her sandaled foot. In the late 20s BC, the Candake of Kush was a woman named Amanirenas. Her husband, King Teretekes, was dead. Her son, Prince Akinadad, ruled alongside her, and the Roman prefect of Egypt, a man named Aelius Gallus, made the strategic error of leaving the southern frontier only lightly garrisoned while he took the main Roman army east on an expedition into Arabia. Amanirenas saw the gap and drove through it. Somewhere around 25 BC, or 24 BC, she led a Kushite army north into Roman Egypt. According to the Greek geographer Strabo, she commanded around 30,000 troops. She sacked the Roman frontier towns of Syene, Philae, and Elephantine. She enslaved the Roman population, plundered the treasuries, and in what would become her signature act, tore down the bronze statues of Augustus that the Romans had erected in the frontier towns. She carried the pieces of those statues back to Meroe as loot. One of those bronze pieces was a larger-than-life head of the young Augustus cast in the classical Greek style with startling inset eyes of calcite, glass, and metal rings. She brought that head back to her capital. She had a temple built, and she had the bronze head of Emperor Augustus buried, face up beneath the steps of the entrance to the temple. Every day, for the rest of her reign, and for generations after her, every Kushite worshipper who entered the temple stepped on the face of the Emperor of Rome. Every day, the ruler of the largest empire the Mediterranean had ever seen had his features ground under the sandals of the people he had wanted to conquer. It is one of the most calculated acts of political theater in the ancient world. When archaeologists excavated the head in 1910, at Meroe they found it exactly where Amanirenas had left it. It is now in the British Museum. Somewhere in the same series of campaigns, Amanirenas took a wound that cost her an eye. Strabo, our main Roman source for the war, describes her as one-eyed. What is unclear is whether she lost the eye in the raid against Syene or in the later fighting against Rome's counterattack. What is clear is that she went on fighting, one-eyed, for years. The Roman response was ferocious. Augustus recalled his general Gaius Petronius from Arabia and sent him south with 3 legions. Petronius drove the Kushites back across the desert. He captured the Kushite city of Napata and razed it. He pushed south toward Meroe itself, but could not take the capital. The war stretched on. Amanirenas retreated, regrouped, harassed Roman supply lines. Her son Akinadad appears to have died in the fighting. Petronius could win battles but could not force a decision. He was stretched thin, hundreds of miles from his supply base and territory where every well could be poisoned and every night could bring a raid. By 22 BC or 21 BC, Amanirenas had grown strong enough again to besiege the Roman garrison at Primus, modern Qasr Ibrim. Petronius relieved it, and then the negotiations began. Amanirenas sent envoys to Augustus himself at Samos, where the emperor was staying, and the Peace of Samos, signed in 21 or 20 BC, was extraordinary. Augustus, who had beaten Cleopatra, who had crushed Antony, who had annexed Egypt and Judea, and half the eastern Mediterranean, gave the Kushites everything they wanted. The frontier was rolled back to a line more favorable to Kush than the pre-war border. Tribute demands were canceled, Kushite prisoners were released, Roman troops withdrew from Qasr Ibrim. Rome, in effect, admitted that the Kingdom of Kush was not a client, not a tributary, but an equal power on the southern frontier. Augustus, the master propagandist, spun the peace as a Roman victory. Kush kept the bronze head under the temple steps. In Mero, Amanirenas continued to rule for another decade. When she finally died, around 10 BC, her successors, Massagetae and Amanirenas, would continue the tradition of Kandake rule and defend the southern frontier successfully for centuries. The relationship between Rome and Kush that Amanirenas established lasted until the collapse of the Meroitic kingdom in the 4th century AD. Rome never sent another army south of the First Cataract. She was one-eyed, she was outnumbered, she was fighting a superpower at the peak of its confidence, and she made that superpower sign a peace treaty on her terms. That was 3. Number 2 was fighting a superpower too, but she was fighting it from the inside. Number 2 is Artemisia I of Caria, the only female fleet commander at the Battle of Salamis, the woman whose ruthless split-second decisions astonished the Greeks who were trying to kill her and the Persian king who was watching her fight. In September of 480 BC, a Persian invasion force of unprecedented size was massing at Phaleron Bay off the coast of Attica. Xerxes, the Persian king of kings, had led his armies across the Hellespont, marched them through Thrace, sacked Athens, and now planned to finish the Greek resistance by destroying the combined Greek fleet in a decisive naval battle. Xerxes commanded, according to Herodotus, more than 1,200 warships, though modern historians think the real number was closer to 700 or 800. In this enormous armada were contingents from Egypt, Phoenicia, Cyprus, Cilicia, and Ionia. And commanding the squadron from the Anatolian region of Caria, the southwestern corner of what is now Turkey, was one commander who did not fit the pattern. Queen Artemisia, the first of Halicarnassus. Artemisia was the daughter of a Carian king named Ligdamis and a Cretan mother whose name is lost. She had inherited the throne of Halicarnassus, along with the neighboring islands of Kos, Kalymnos, and Niceros, after the death of her husband, whose name we also do not know. She had a grown son, but she had not stayed home. She had joined the invasion of Greece, personally commanding 5 warships of her own. Herodotus, who was born in Halicarnassus himself and knew her family, wrote that Artemisia's ships were the second most famous squadron in the entire Persian fleet after the Sidonians, and that she gave the king the best counsels of all his allies. Before the Battle of Salamis, Xerxes assembled his commanders and asked them whether he should fight a naval battle in the narrow straits between the mainland and the island of Salamis. Every commander said yes, fight. Only one commander said no. Artemisia stood up in the council of the King of Kings and told him that the Greek ships were superior to his in that particular kind of fighting, that the narrow water favored them, and that if he waited and simply pressed the Greeks by land, they would starve or scatter or come to blows among themselves. Herodotus reports her advice word for word. Xerxes praised her. Then he ignored her advice and gave the order to fight. On the morning of the battle, Xerxes had a throne set up on the shore of Attica on the slopes of Mount Agelaos, so that he could watch the battle personally. His scribes stood beside him, recording the names of every Persian captain who fought well. From his throne, he watched his fleet enter the strait. The Greek fleet. Under the Athenian commander, Themistocles backed up the strait to draw the Persians in. Then it turned and counterattacked. The Persian ships, packed tight, could not maneuver. Greek triremes rammed and boarded them methodically. The Persian line dissolved into chaos. In the middle of that chaos, Artemisia's flagship was spotted and chased by an Athenian trireme commanded by a captain named Amanirenas of Palmyra. Amanirenas closed in for the ramming attack. The Athenians did not know that a woman was aboard, but they knew from the standards that they were pursuing an enemy admiral. Artemisia's escape was blocked. Persian ships were fleeing all around her, and the Athenian was gaining. She had, in that instant, the reflexes of a killer. There was a Persian allied ship in her way, commanded by a fellow Carian, King Damasithymos of Calinda. It flew Persian colors. It was on her side. She rammed it. Her bronze beak went straight through the hull of her ally's warship. Damasithymos and his crew went to the bottom of the strait. The Athenian trireme, pursuing Artemisia, saw what happened next. Watching an Ionian ship ramming another Ionian ship, the Athenian captain assumed that Artemisia's vessel must be a Greek deserter fighting for the Greeks. He broke off pursuit and looked for another target. Artemisia sailed clear of the disaster. On the shore, Xerxes had watched the entire episode. His courtiers, seeing his ship in the middle of the fight, told him what had happened, though they mistakenly identified the vessel she had rammed as a Greek ship rather than an ally. Xerxes did not know she had sunk one of his own captains. He believed she had just destroyed a Greek trireme in the middle of the chaos. According to Herodotus, he turned to his advisors and delivered the sentence that has followed Artemisia for 2,500 years. My men have become women, and my women, men. Xerxes did not lie only to himself about Artemisia. He turned to her advice one more time after the battle when the Persian fleet had been shattered and he had to decide whether to press the campaign or withdraw. He asked her whether he should stay and fight on with his army under Mardonius or return to Sardis and let Mardonius finish the Greeks alone. She told him to leave Mardonius behind. She told him he had already burned Athens and the objective of the campaign was accomplished, and that if Mardonius succeeded, the credit would be his, and if Mardonius failed, the failure would be Mardonius's alone. Xerxes took the advice this time. He withdrew to Sardis. Mardonius was defeated and killed at Plataea the following year. Xerxes sent Artemisia home to Ephesus with a suit of Greek armor as a gift of honor, and he entrusted his illegitimate sons to her care for the trip. She went home to Halicarnassus and vanishes from the historical record. Salamis is remembered as one of the most decisive battles of the ancient world. It saved Greek civilization. It doomed the Persian invasion. And in the middle of the wreckage, the only enemy commander who had told the truth about the odds was a queen who then rammed her own ally to survive it. That was 2. And now at number 1, we come to the queen who fits every superlative on this list at once. The one who fought the largest army, the one who killed the greatest king, the one who did the most unforgivable thing. Number 1 is Queen Tomiris of the Massagetae, the Scythian queen who defeated and killed Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire in 530 BC, and who then took his severed head and dunked it into a wineskin full of human blood and told him to drink his fill. Cyrus the Great was, by the year 530 BC, the most powerful man on earth. He had built, in the space of a single lifetime, the largest empire the world had ever seen. He had defeated the Medes, absorbing their empire. He had conquered Lydia, capturing the fabulously wealthy King Croesus. He had absorbed the Greek cities of Ionia. He had taken Babylon, ending the Chaldean Empire and liberating the Jews from their captivity. His empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus, from the Caucasus to the deserts of Arabia. His name meant something like the sun. And in 530 BC, at the age of about 70, he decided that he needed one more conquest. He needed the steppes of Central Asia. He needed the Massagetae. The Massagetae were a Scythian confederation of nomadic tribes who lived east of the Caspian Sea in what is now Turkmenistan, western Uzbekistan, and southern Kazakhstan. They rode small, tough horses. They fought with lances, bows, and battle axes. Their women rode into battle alongside their men, held property in their own names, and enjoyed a level of legal freedom that shocked Greek observers. And they were ruled at the time. Cyrus turned his eye toward them by a widow queen named Tomiris. Her name in the original Saka language was probably something like Tomaria. The Greeks rendered it Tomiris. She had inherited her throne after the death of her husband, and she ruled alongside her adult son, a prince named Spargapaces, who commanded the Massagetae army as her general. Cyrus did the diplomatic thing first. He sent an embassy to Tomiris proposing marriage. The proposal was a fig leaf. It was, in fact, a demand for surrender wrapped in a wedding ring. If Tomiris accepted, Cyrus would absorb the Massagetae territories into his empire through the union. Tomiris, according to Herodotus, was aware that it was her kingdom, not herself, that Cyrus courted. She rejected the marriage. She told the Persian ambassadors to go home and inform their king that he should rule his own lands and let her rule hers. Cyrus's response was to march. He built a bridge of boats across the Jaxartes River, modern Sirdaria, and began preparing to invade Massagetae territory in force. Tomiris sent one more message. She told Cyrus to withdraw across the river and to fight the Massagetae in the open steppe, in fair battle. Or, if he preferred, she said the Massagetae would withdraw a 3-day march and let him cross the river unopposed so that battle could be joined on his terms. Cyrus took a middle path, and it was the wrong path. He crossed the river with a small advance force under his son Cambyses and his advisor Croesus, the former king of Lydia, and set up a lavish banquet camp full of food and wine. Then he withdrew the bulk of his army and left the banquet in place as bait. The trap worked. The Massagetae advance guard, commanded by Prince Spargapeses, attacked the banquet camp, killed the small Persian guard, and then, according to Herodotus, made the mistake of eating and drinking everything they had captured. The Massagetae were unfamiliar with wine. Their ordinary intoxicants were fermented mare's milk and cannabis smoke. Wine hit them harder than they expected. Spargapeses and his troops fell asleep at the banquet in a drunken stupor. Cyrus's main army returned and killed most of them where they lay. Spargapeses was captured alive. He sobered up in Persian captivity, understood what had happened to him, and according to Herodotus, took his own life out of shame. Tomiris received the news of her son's capture and death from a Persian herald. She did not weep. She sent a herald of her own back to Cyrus, and the message she sent has been quoted by every historian who has ever written about her since. She called wine the drug that made the Persians speak evil words when they consumed it. She told Cyrus he had won only through the treachery of that drug, not through any courage of his own. And she swore by the sun that if he did not immediately withdraw across the river, she would give him more blood than he could drink. Cyrus did not withdraw. Tomiris did not wait. She led the main Massagetae army against him personally, in the open steppe in the fight she had originally proposed. Herodotus called the battle that followed the fiercest engagement ever fought between non-Greek peoples. He described the battle in stages. First, both armies exchanged arrows at long range until their quivers were empty. Then they closed and fought with lances. Then, when the lances broke, they fought hand-to-hand with daggers and battle axes. The fighting went on for hours. Neither side yielded. And in the end, Herodotus said, the Massagetae, riding better horses fighting for their own soil, avenging a young prince, prevailed. Most of the Persian army was destroyed. Cyrus himself, king of kings, founder of the largest empire in history to that date, fell somewhere on the field. Tomiris rode across the battlefield after the fighting ended. She had ordered the Massagetae to take no prisoners. She had also ordered them to fill a wineskin with the blood of the fallen Persians. Her men gathered the blood as she asked. She found Cyrus's body among the dead. She had it beheaded, and she took the head and she pushed it down into the wineskin full of blood until the blood covered it, and she said the words that have been quoted more times than perhaps any other sentence spoken by a woman in the ancient world. I threatened you, Cyrus, that I would give you your fill of blood, and now I keep my word. Drink. That was the end of Cyrus the Great. The Persian Empire he founded went on for another 200 years, but it was ruled after that by his son Cambyses, and then by his son-in-law Darius I. Cyrus's dream of absorbing the steppes of Central Asia was dead. His body, if Herodotus is to be believed, was returned to Persia after negotiations and buried in the tomb at Massagetae, where the tomb still stands today. But the head, according to the same tradition, spent one final night in a leather bag full of blood held in the hands of the widow of a small Central Asian kingdom that had refused to bow. There are historians who doubt the story. Herodotus wrote 100 years after the events. No Persian text confirms it. Ctesias and Xenophon give different accounts of Cyrus's death. Some archaeologists point out that no Persian mass graves have ever been found in the Sir Daria Basin. But every ancient civilization that heard the story kept telling it. Strabo repeated it, Jordanes repeated it, Cassiodorus repeated it, Rubens painted it, Renaissance Italian artists like Andrea del Castagno painted it. And a nomadic queen of the steppes, whose name and language are barely known outside the specialists, became one of the most famous women in the recorded memory of the ancient world. Because when she stood over the body of the man who had built the Persian Empire and dunked his head in blood, she did what no queen on this list, and no king in the ancient world, ever did more completely. She made an empire kneel. Not through diplomacy, not through negotiation, not through a peace treaty, but by killing its founder in the field and telling him, dead, to drink. That was one. Tomiris of the Massagetae. And that is the countdown. 10 women who rode elephants, commanded fleets, buried emperors under their steppes, torched cities with sparrows, and severed the heads of kings. They ruled from the Caucasus, from Mercia, from the Nile, from the deserts of Palmyra and Arabia, from the jungles of Vietnam, from the steppes of Central Asia. Some of them died in bed, some of them died on the battlefield, some of them died on mountaintops, refusing to surrender at the age of 22. All 10 of them made an empire kneel, and the ancient world, when it wrote about them, did not know quite what to do with them. Herodotus said his marvel was that a woman had led men in war. Xerxes said his men had become women, and his women men. Roman chroniclers said the sky itself weeps for what Amanirenas did. Chinese historians said it is easy to fight a tiger with a spear, but hard to face the queen. None of them, apparently, understood the simplest possible explanation for what they were watching, which is that a crown does not have a gender, and neither does a sword, and neither does the willingness to use both. If this ranking changed how you understand ancient history, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people who need to know that queens like Tomiris and Amanirenas existed. Hit subscribe for more honest deep dive military history from the ancient world. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these countdowns. And drop a comment right now. Tell us which of the 10 queens surprised you most. Tell us who we missed. Tell us who deserves to be on the next list, and tell us where you are watching from. Our community spans the entire world, and every viewer is part of what keeps real ancient history alive. Thank you for watching. These 10 women deserve to be remembered for what they actually did in blood and steel and on the backs of war elephants, and not softened by history into wives, mothers, or footnotes. We'll see you in the next one.